I am Ryan McKnight.
I'm Cara Santamaria.
I am Christopher Smith.
Hi, I'm Andrew Torres.
This is Naked Mormonism,
the serial Mormon history podcast. Welcome to Naked Mormonism, the serial Mormon history podcast. I'm your host, Bryce Blankenagel. I'm a history communicator, and I really appreciate you taking some time to give this podcast a listen. This podcast is a chronological history of Joseph Smith and early Mormonism. The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints today boasts a membership of over 16 million people and is the wealthiest and most politically powerful religion in America. The religion started by Joseph Smith, originally called the Church of Christ, eventually became the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. It has over 400 child sects as of the early 21st century. Mormonism, for many, is more than just a religion, but an identity. Mormons pride themselves as being a peculiar people. A peculiar people obviously carry a peculiar history, and the focus of this podcast is to demystify and to secularize the history of Mormonism. I've done my best to make the chronology of early Mormonism interesting and accessible, even to those with absolutely no background or personal attachment to the religion, the culture, or its history. Believe it or not, Mormon history is interesting enough that even those who've never been a member of the church can find it just as fascinating as those who believe the supernatural claims made by the various leaders of the various Mormon sects. My hope is that regardless of your personal beliefs, you find the field of Mormon history fascinating and the characters within it compelling, flawed, and most importantly, human. At the end of today's episode, I'll give you a brief introduction to myself, as well as kind of a directory, a table of contents for the backlog of the podcast. So with that introduction out of the way, let's begin with the history of early Mormonism in the only place that we can, with the founder himself, Joseph Smith. Joe was born in Sharon, Vermont on December 23rd, 1805. Brief side note, if you don't like Joseph Smith being called Joe, this may not be the podcast for you, but I encourage you to step outside of your comfort zone and continue listening. The Smith family were exceptionally destitute, forcing the members of the family to seek nearly any source of income to keep themselves fed. Most of what we know about Joe's early life comes from his mother, Lucy Mack Smith, when she dictated her personal history of the Smith family and Joseph Smith in 1845, the year after Joseph Smith was assassinated while he was running for president of the United States. Sources of Joe's early life outside of Lucy's biographical sketches don't emerge until the early to mid-1820s, when Joe began to enter the public sphere and begin to make a name for himself. Now, Joe's parents are fascinating people, Joseph Sr. and Lucy Mack Smith. Joseph Sr. didn't seem to be much for religion, instead engaging in more spiritual and magical and deistic pursuits, which we'll discuss momentarily. Lucy, on the other hand, was much more inclined toward organized religion. She remembers in her memoir, quote, "While we were yet living in the town of Tunbridge, I was very seriously impressed the subject of religion, occasioned probably by my singular experience while sick at Randolph, and I endeavored to persuade my husband to attend the Methodist meeting with me. He went a few times to gratify me, for he had so little faith in the doctrines taught by them that my feelings were the only inducement for him to go. But as soon as his father and brother Jesse heard that we were attending Methodist meeting, they were much displeased, and his father came to the door one day and threw Tom Paine's Age of Reason into the house, and angrily bade him read that until he believed it. They also told him that he ought not to let his wife go to the meetings, and it would be far better for him to stop going. Accordingly, my husband requested me to not go, as it gave our friends such disagreeable feelings. He thought it was hardly worth our while." End quote. While Joseph Sr. was chastised by his father and his brother to read the quintessential pamphlet of deism by Thomas Paine, Lucy began her own quest for spiritual enlightenment. Lucy went into, quote, a grove of handsome wild cherry trees and prayed to the Lord that he would so influence the heart of my husband that he would be induced to receive the gospel, end quote. Lucy didn't receive her enlightenment in the woods that day, but instead went home depressed in spirits, she says. However, as she was falling asleep that night, a vision opened to her where she, quote, gazed upon beautiful trees with wonder and admiration. And after beholding them a short time, I saw one of them was surrounded with a bright belt that shone like burnished gold, but far more brilliantly, end quote. In this vision, as she viewed these trees with a fairy ring around their base, she noticed that the trees were blowing in the wind and they seemed lively and animated in appearance, which conveyed, quote, the utmost joy and happiness, end quote. A dancing sunbeam shone down on everything in her vision that night, and Lucy, quote, wondered, what can be the meaning of all this? And the interpretation given me was that the personated my husband and my oldest brother, Jesse Smith, that the stubborn and unyielding tree was like Jesse, that the other, more pliant and flexible, was like Joseph, my husband, that the breath of heaven which passed over them was the pure and undefiled gospel of the Son of God, which gospel Jesse would always resist, but which Joseph, when he was more advanced in life, would hear and receive with his whole heart and rejoice therein, end quote. Soon after Lucy had her first vision experience, Joseph Sr. had a series of 7 similar visions, which also included descriptions of him eating plants that may have been psychedelic and seeing wealthy people in great and spacious building. Elements within these visions would resurface in Joe's own writings within the pages of the Book of Mormon and the Book of Moses, with the visions of Lehi, Nephi, and Enoch. It's also worth noting that the visions Lucy reported that she and her husband had, they were only ever written down in her memoir, dictated in 1845, 15 years after the Book of Mormon was published and the church was founded by her son, Joseph Jr. Now, the direction of influence of these visions remains a subject of controversy among historians today. What is undisputed, however, is that the Smith family in the 1800s to the 1820s were seekers, rarely siding with any specific religious creed in lieu of wandering the world of non-denominational spiritualism or deism. This helps us to understand the magic worldview of the Smith family and other aspects of their story that we'll be discussing in just a few minutes here. Before that, a few stories from Joe's early childhood are worth mentioning. The Smith children were stricken with an epidemic of typhoid. Joe's oldest sister, Sophronia Smith, lay catatonic for nearly 3 months and was presumed dead before she recovered. Young Joseph also took ill, and he recovered, but not without some long-term consequences. A growth emerged on his shoulder which was lanced, but the infection remained. And that infection eventually migrated to his leg, and he was unable to walk for weeks. Finally, a surgeon resolved to amputate young Joe's leg. Now, amputation in the 19th century, that was a condemnation to a life of vagrancy, and Lucy wanted better for her son. Lucy recalls the conversation with the surgeon, quote, "Amputation is absolutely necessary in order to save his life." This was like a thunderbolt to me. I appealed to the principal surgeon, saying, "Dr. Stone, can you not make another trial? Can you not, by cutting around the bone, take out the diseased part, and perhaps that which is sound will heal over, and by this means you will save his leg? You will not, you must not take off his leg until you try once more. I will not consent to let you enter his room until you make me this promise." End quote. According to Lucy, in the same memoir, the surgeon agreed to cut out the infected portion of the bone instead of amputating. The operation ended up succeeding, but it left unseen scars in the mind of the young boy. He apparently refused to be bound to the table with cords, and he also refused any alcohol to mitigate the pain. Now, Mormons are taught in Sunday school that this is evidence of Joseph Smith's temperance, and it's often taught in conjunction with the Mormon health code prohibiting alcohol, known as the Word of Wisdom. However, the story is best understood when we attribute Joe's aversion to alcohol as a result of his father's bouts of debauchery. Joseph Sr. was a quote-unquote noted drunk, around town, and even excused his conduct in a patriarchal blessing to his son, who was always helping the Smith family while Joseph Sr. was quote-unquote out of the way with wine. Young Joe had his entire childhood of seeing what alcohol did to his father and how his mother reacted to Joseph Sr. often being drunk, and how that impacted the family, and he likely refused the alcohol on those bases. Now, once again, however, we only know of this story from Lucy, remembering it nearly 3 decades after it happened, so we have to take the story with a grain of salt. During Joe's recovery period from this surgery, Joe's older brothers, Alvin and Hiram, cared for the young boy, often carrying him around on their backs when he became too tired from walking on crutches. The Smith family eventually moved from Vermont to Palmyra, New York, in search of livelihood following the Summer Without Sun. This Summer Without Sun was the result of a volcanic eruption which created an atmospheric blanket and starved crops for the year of 1816. The Smiths made their living largely from menial labor and by running a cake and beer shop. And this cake and beer shop would be made by Lucy, and it was distributed around the town, particularly in the summer, by the children and Joseph Sr. Lucy also painted rugs and did palm readings in order to help make ends meet. They also harvested and made maple sugar during the winters to sell, and Lucy claims that they made upwards of 1,000 pounds of maple sugar per year. And at the age of 14, a fascinating occurrence happened to the young Joseph Smith. And once again, this comes from Lucy, who, believed her beloved son Joseph could do no wrong, which makes the occurrence that much more remarkable to be found in the pages of her memoir. Quote, "At the age of 14, an incident occurred which alarmed us much, as we knew not the cause of it. Joseph being a remarkably quiet, well-disposed child, we did not suspect that anyone had aught against him. He was out one evening on an errand, and on returning home, as he was passing through the dooryard, a gun was fired across his pathway with the evident intention of shooting him. He sprang to the door much frightened. We immediately went in search of the assassin, but could find no trace of him that evening. The next morning we found his tracks under a wagon where he lay when fired, and the following day we found the balls which were discharged from the gun lodged in the head and neck of a cow that was standing opposite the wagon in a dark corner. We have not as yet discovered the man who made this attempt at murder, neither can we discover the cause thereof." End quote. At age 14, somebody tried to murder the young Joseph Smith. The circumstances and identity of this murder attempt are still unknown, leaving the details purely speculative. Speculation without being informed, however, that's just dreaming. To understand what might motivate somebody to kill Joseph Smith at age 14, we need to understand how he and the rest of the Smith men were making money at this time. Let's begin with how the Smiths became incredibly destitute to begin with. Joe's parents, Lucy and Joseph Sr., were married in 1796, and according to Lucy's history, her brother Stephen gave her a wedding gift of $1,000. But as a harbinger of future events, Joseph Sr. lost the entire amount when he was suckered into an investment scam. He spent the family's savings buying ginseng and then arranged to export it after it was crystallized to China, where the investment would return a healthy sum. His business partner, Mr. Stevens, ran off to Canada with the entire proceeds of the deal, leaving Joseph Sr. with $1,800 in debt, shouldered by the entire Smith family. They sold their farm, which was worth about $1,500, for just $800 in order to cover a portion of the debt. The other $1,000 came out of Lucy's wedding gift, leaving the newlyweds with nothing. The impacts of this investment and being scammed out of this money are far-reaching, because I would speculate that the lesson that young Joe took from his dad getting scammed in this scheme was that there are two kinds of people in this world: those who cheat and those who get cheated. Lucy's father let the newlyweds rent part of his Vermont farmland for a while until they were able to kind of get back up onto their feet. In order to finance their move to New York, Lucy had to sell everything the family owned in order to pay their debts before they could leave, and Joseph Sr. had to borrow more money in order to pay for a wagon to carry them to New York. Lucy's family history says she arrived in Palmyra with 2 cents in cash. Their first year in New York, they apparently did all right, and that's mostly because Lucy started a successful business decorating furniture by painting oilcloth, a source of income for basically Lucy's entire life. Joseph Sr. and his sons built a cabin, and they cleared some farmland by felling trees on a small plot of land, but the second year, they were barely able to make their mortgage payment. Lucy says they were, quote, destitute of money, property, or acquaintance, end quote. The only reason they kept the farm was because the oldest son, Alvin, worked himself to the bone as a hired hand, just earning any scrap of money he can get to pay the mortgage. Alvin managed to stabilize his parents' finances, and he started building them a nicer house in 1824, but then he got sick and he died, leaving the family without its primary provider. And, of course, Alvin's death is a story for a future episode. But the Smiths, as a result of all of these decisions, they remained very destitute. They began selling cake and beer out of the shop, but unfortunately, Joseph Sr. probably dabbled a little too deep into the company's stock. Neighbors said that Joseph Sr. was a noted drunkard. Neighbor Lorenzo Saunders even told a story about Joseph Sr. getting drunk at the pub and bragging about how large his penis was. Apparently, in this instance, the other drunks tried to measure it and pushed a ruler through the seat of his pants in order to do it. And at one point, Joseph Sr. attended a turkey shoot and was so wasted that he tried to curse the other men's guns so that they would miss every shot. You see, Joseph Sr. was never a stable support for the family, and we can understand the influences a father figure like this would have on young Joseph throughout his impressionable childhood and teenage years, especially in a home with 11 people in it and scarce resources. The Smith men mostly just did odd jobs, and they didn't ever have very stable income and even a great reputation in the neighborhood. One of the odd jobs that they did was money digging. This requires a bit of a treatment because it informs many of Joe's religious praxis throughout his entire life and ministry. The Smith family believed that the world was moved and shaped by magic. Lucy deals with criticisms that the whole Smith family experienced relative to these magic practices in her memoir. Quote, I shall change my theme for the present, but let not my reader suppose that because I shall pursue another topic for a season, that we stopped our labor and went at trying to win the faculty of a brack, drawing magic circles or soothsaying to the neglect of all kinds of business. We never during our lives suffered one important interest to swallow up every other obligation, but whilst we worked with our hands, we endeavored to remember the service of and the welfare of our souls. And not only temporal blessings were bestowed upon us, but also spiritual were administered. The scripture which saith, Your old men shall dream dreams, was fulfilled in the case of my husband, for about this time he had another vision, which I shall here relate. End quote. And after that passage, of course, she relates the 6th of 7 visions that Joseph Sr. experienced. Now, I don't want that phrase to get lost in the passage. Trying to win the faculty of a brack is an important phrase. The faculty of a brack is a magical invocation, a protection spell, if you will. A brack here could mean the spirit, which moves and shapes the magic that flows through all life and throughout the universe, or it could refer more explicitly to a specific spirit with more definite properties. These magical spirits shouldn't be construed to be, satanic or evil, as the beliefs in magic are perfectly consistent with Christian theology and are informed by Christian theology. The faculty of a brack wasn't a deity to worship, it was merely a spirit by which the Almighty God administered his will on the real, tangible world. In the minds of the Smiths, magic was what caused the grass to grow, the earth to turn, and the sun to shine. Achievements are a good fortune. Those are the blessings of God. Misfortunes and illness are curses from evil and familiar spirits. This world of occult traditions, and by occult here I mean the ye olde definition of occultere, which means to hide or to conceal or to secrete or to cover over. This occult, this world of occult traditions, was the mechanism by which to understand the mind of God. The magic worldview, it may seem foreign to us, but people sleep with crystals under their pillows and pray 5 times a day to their deity. Some of those people face Mecca, others just speak, the same exact prayers with the same exact words, with the same inflection and the same tone of voice, and same everything so as not to offend the Almighty Spirit that's blessing their food. Natural disasters, pandemics, all forms of human suffering can be explained through the will and power of God within the magic worldview by people without the scientific underpinnings to understand what's really going on. Magic thinking takes on all forms, and there are plenty of people alive today who engage in the exact occult practices the Smith family did for all sorts of purposes. Part of this occult practice is coding information in stories. For example, Lucy Mack Smith recounts 5 of Joseph Sr.'s 7 dreams more than 30 years after he had them in very explicit detail. It seems that Lucy was coding information in those visions for only those who know the world of magic and the occult to have the spiritual eyes to decipher those stories. What that coded information is, well, that's a story for another time. Now, how these magic and occult practices manifested in the Smith family came about in different ways. They would use divining rods, sticks made from metal or witch hazel wood, to locate water or to locate buried treasure. Now, modern prophets in Mormonism are called prophets, seers, and revelators in the church, but the term seer has a rich tradition in occultism. A seer was a person who could literally see things that others couldn't see. They would use their spiritual eyes to locate what others desired to locate. Think of it kind of like, gazing at a crystal ball, but less to do with, prophesying future events and fortune-telling, and more to see physical objects or even events that are existing or happening in the same, location or at some remote location that the physical or the natural eyes can't perceive. Joseph Smith, young Joe, was a seer long before he became a prophet or revelator, and a magic rock viewed in a dark location was his magic implement of choice. A brown seer stone, a white seer stone, a number of different seer stones, oftentimes buried in a hat in order to exclude the light. Now, there are many implements that magic users will employ to understand the forces of God's creation. Some will hold up a cane in the middle of a circle, and wherever the cane falls will answer their question. Some will hold sticks and wait for the stick to twitch in their hands, divination. Some will open the Bible to a random page and point out a random passage, seeking an answer to a question that they have. For some people, it's astrology or numerology. All of these practices and magic tools operate within the world of the occult, the hidden world, which underpins the physical world around us. Each of these tools reveal the unseen world, and therefore the mind and will of God. These magic practices also create an economy. A person who can see things that others can't claims a skill that other people don't have, and can therefore charge money for it. To make ends meet, at night, the Smiths would go out and dig for Indian springs, or old Spanish mines, or chests of pirate gold and other buried treasures. This may seem insane to us, but there was a whole treasure-digging culture in New York, and a whole genre of stories about treasure that's guarded by spirits and by ghosts. The common practice of treasure diggers was to hire a diviner or a seer to locate the treasure, and a conjurer or a necromancer to bind the spirit so they could get the treasure before the binding spell broke, and the guardian spirit was able to secrete the treasure into another location or take it further underground. But if during this magic ritual you committed some error in the ritual, like speaking out of turn, or placing the iron or witch hazel rods in the wrong place on the ground, or speaking the incantation incorrectly, performing the spell under the wrong governing planet, or myriad other errors, the spirit would whisk away the treasure and cause it to sink further in the ground. The ground gnomes are so very elusive. Understandably, the treasure-digging group almost always committed some error, or they didn't account for some variable, and the treasure would be lost before it could be unearthed. Usually, the conjurer still managed to walk away with a little pocket money from the person who hired them to begin with. The diggers themselves were probably comprised of some folks who understood that this was a con, and others who truly believed that they'd eventually get the money that was located by the seer or the diviner. However, other aspects of treasure digging were just unabashedly a con. Historian Dan Vogel, in his biography of Joseph Smith, has laid out convincingly how these seers and spirit conjurers basically were con artists, preying on naive farmers by leading them on with the promise of treasure. Joe got pretty good at this hustle, a business that he likely picked up from Joseph Sr. or plenty of other magic mentors in his life, like Samuel Lawrence or Sally Chase, Joseph Knight, or Luman Walters. Joe developed a reputation in the Palmyra and the Manchester neighborhood for being a powerful seer. About 1823, he started telling stories about a golden book that was buried somewhere in the neighborhood, an ancient record written on golden plates. What a fantastic treasure. Now, while Alvin's death, his older brother's death, is a story for another day, one of the last things that Alvin said to him before he died was, quote, "Do everything that lies in your power to obtain the record," end quote, referring to this book of gold plates. With Alvin gone, Joseph Sr. drunk half of the time, and Lucy at home trying desperately to support 10 kids and to make ends meet by painting rugs or, reading people's fortunes on their palm, Joe's treasure-digging con offered a potential way to feed the family. Here's one example of what this looked like from a neighbor named William Stafford. According to Stafford, the Smiths, quote, "devised a scheme by which they might satiate their hunger with the mutton of one of my sheep. They had seen in my flock of sheep a large, fat, black wether. Old Joseph and one of the boys came to me one day and said that Joseph Jr. had discovered some very remarkable and valuable treasures which could only be procured in one way. That way was as follows: that a black sheep should be taken onto the ground where the treasures were concealed, that after cutting its throat it should be led around a circle while bleeding. This being done, the wrath of the evil spirit would be appeased. The treasures could then be obtained, and my share of them was to be fourfold. To gratify my curiosity, I let them have a large fat sheep. They afterwards informed me that the sheep was killed pursuant to commandment, but as there was some mistake in the process, it did not have the desired effect. This, I believe, is the only time they ever made money digging a profitable business," end quote. This language that Stafford used here is super important. Pursuant to commandment and the weather being black particularly are both important ingredients to Christian occult magic. The lamb was to be used as the scapegoat for cleansing the diggers of any of their sins. They would cast their sins by magic invocation into the weather, then sacrifice it and spread its blood in a circle around the location of the buried treasure, thus binding the treasure and its evil spirit guardian to the location long enough for them to dig it up and to unearth the treasure and then cast the guardian spirit off from the treasure. This is all deeply rooted in Israelite, Kabbalah, and Torah tradition of sacrificial offerings, and they likely burned the lamb as a sacrifice once it had been bled out, and then they probably consumed the kosher meat. Now, D. Michael Quinn's Early Mormonism and the Magic Worldview deals with this synthesis of Christian beliefs and occult traditions. Quote, "No known denunciation of the family ever used the phrase faculty of a brack, even though Lucy Mack Smith did. Neighbors accused Joseph Sr. and Jr. of practicing certain treasure-digging ceremonies, and it was Lucy Smith who used the phrase linking these accusations to ritual magic. Mormon historian Richard L. Bushman observed that thereby Lucy revealed a knowledge of magical formulas and rituals. One Palmyra resident reported that the prophet's mother also performed various forms of magic divination, including palmistry. Marvin S. Hill has concluded, in her magic circles, soothsaying and other magical arts were one with her religious activities." End quote. And even the dagger that they likely used in slitting the throat of this lamb had magical significance. Quote, "The Hiram Smith family has preserved as an heirloom the kind of dagger necessary for ritual magic," end quote, which D. Michael Quinn prints a picture of in his book. It's been retained in the Smith family. In this book, Early Mormonism and the Magic Worldview, it's a fantastic read. Now, today's perspective of occult being tied to Satanism and evil spirits and stuff, that's a modern perspective. It's our modern interpretation of those things, and it doesn't map to the 19th century. The division between white and black magic was closely observed by Joe and the family in order to be shown the gift and power of God in all of their endeavors. As we'll see in coming episodes, it becomes possible to come to all sorts of conclusions about what God thinks is righteous or sinful when a person's worldview is shaped by this kind of thinking. Now, for a lot of people, the question then becomes, did Joseph Smith really believe in this magic stuff, or was it all just a con? And I think that's a false dichotomy, because both can be true. He made his meager living from clearly conning people with the hopes that one day the treasure they finally acquired would get him rich. Enough failed digs, however, will produce more deliberate cons to pay the bills. Produce enough deliberate cons, and eventually those cons must evolve, expand, and adapt to changing circumstances and wider audiences. And thus we see the blueprints of any religion right before our natural eyes. Understandably, these cons eventually exhaust themselves for want of more credulous minds. If any con artist operates in a single location for long enough, their reputation will eventually precede them, and business dries up because people talk to each other. As a result, the Smiths gained a pretty low reputation in New York while hunting for buried treasure under the cover of night. Now, there's no evidence that the Smiths actually found any treasure, making it pretty obvious, at least to educated people, that this whole thing was, at worst, a con, and at best, a totally unproductive hobby. Notably as well, although there isn't any solid evidence of this occurring with the Smith treasure diggers specifically, buried treasure was a great way to launder counterfeit money. You know, a habitually destitute person walks into the local shop with a bag of gold coins. People are going to be skeptical as to where that gold came from. Well, I found it while digging in the woods. That's a satisfying explanation for a while, and it may even motivate more folks to join the group and to fund treasure digs of their own. And when those digs come up dry, the conjuration was performed incorrectly, and then the dupe walks away with their pockets lighter, and the Smiths have a few meals paid for. Notably, accusations of counterfeit plagued Joseph Jr. for much of his public life and even contributed to his assassination in Carthage jail in 1844. Hardworking people who take the slow, the hard way to wealth and to comfort have always looked at people who chase get-rich-quick schemes as lazy. And laziness became a common description of Joseph Smith and other members of the Smith family. A New York neighbor of the Smiths, Parley Chase, said in a sworn affidavit dated December 13, 1833, quote, that not one of the male members of the Smith family were entitled to any credit whatsoever. They were lazy, intemperate, and worthless men, very much addicted to lying. In this, they frequently boasted of their skill. Digging for money was their principal employment, end quote. A March 20th, 1834 affidavit signed by 11 New York neighbors to the Smiths family said that the Smiths, quote, were not only a lazy, indolent set of men, but also intemperate, and their word was not to be depended upon, and that we are truly glad to dispense with their society, end quote. Henry Harris's affidavit, signed December 9th, 1833, said the Smiths, quote, were regarded by the community in which they lived as a lying and indolent set of men, and no confidence could be placed in them, end quote. William R. Hine said in an affidavit in the 1880s, he was a neighbor as well, that he, quote, heard a man say who was a neighbor of the Mormon Smith family in Palmyra, New York, that they were thieves, indolent, the lowest and meanest family he ever saw or heard of, end quote. A mail carrier who regularly passed through Palmyra on his way back and forth from Canada to Kansas said in an article published in June 7th, 1855, Texas Ranger, quote, I well remember of hearing frequently of the pranks of Lazy Joe, end quote. Even Lorenzo Saunders, who liked the Smith family and really liked Joseph Smith and defended him in a court of law, said the Smiths were great sugar makers, but also said in an interview in 1884 that, quote, Joseph Smith never did work. They claimed there in that book that Joe Smith was a great worker. He was a lazy dog, I tell you the truth, end quote. Indolence, intemperance, laziness, not to be depended upon, addicted to lying. These are not resounding endorsements of Joseph and the Smith family. Now, I would balance these accusations with other quotes from people around the Smiths, neighbors, that claim that they were good people, that they were temperate, that they were kind, that they were religious, that they were devout, anything. But they don't exist. Those quotes don't exist. In fact, almost anybody connected to the Smith family in the late 1810s into the late 1820s had nothing but bad to say about Joseph and the Smith family. I'm always happy to be proven wrong and make corrections, but after studying Joe's early life for quite a bit, the dearth of public statements that had anything nice to say about Joe is stark evidence of his character itself. What follows this episode is a historical timeline in an attempt to construct a narrative of Joseph Smith's life with the documents that we have available to us. I want to personally commend the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints for the incredible amount of work that they've done digitizing documents from the Joseph Smith period of church history through their Joseph Smith Papers project. If not for the availability of these documents online, the job of collecting, analyzing, and collating all these documents into a coherent timeline for a podcast would have been significantly more difficult of an endeavor. So that's all a very brief introduction to the early life and history of Joseph Smith. What you'll find in the backlog of this podcast is a progression of the timeline from this point forward. Each episode is a scripted essay, researched, written, recorded, and produced by yours truly. To explain what you'll hear as you progress through the episode, permit me a few minutes to tell you a little bit about myself. I grew up in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in Utah, Mormonism. I checked all the boxes of a young man born of goodly parents in the church, baptized at 8, priesthood at 12, patriarchal blessing at 14, home teaching, passing sacrament, Eagle Scout, priesthood callings, the whole gamut. I never much liked going to church, but I had a solid testimony that the church is true. A burning in my bosom had confirmed it, so it must be true. At about the age of 15, my lethargy for the high-demand religion began to really kind of sink in. A little after I turned 16 years old, I told my parents I didn't want to go to church anymore, and they were okay with it. And I was very lucky to have them be very understanding. I have an older sister who'd stopped going to church before me, so my parents learned from that experience with her that it was best to just kind of let me walk my own path, for which I am forever grateful to them. So I graduated high school, I went to a year of university, Weber State, go Wildcats, and then I dropped out to enter the workforce. I moved out on my own at the first possible moment, and I didn't think much about religion or belief in God. I'd listened to enough George Carlin that I considered all religions to be wrong, and atheist was the best way to describe me. Eventually, I got a job driving a truck around northern Utah, which resulted in an epiphany. And that's a story that you'll hear about on the show eventually. From that epiphany, I learned to enjoy everything. It didn't matter what I was doing, I can find joy in it, a philosophy to which I abide today. While driving a truck for 10 hours a day, podcasts eventually supplanted, Chelsea Green and Whitechapel on repeat, and I truly began to examine faith, belief, and what motivates people to do what they do. After hundreds of hours of debates, thousands of hours of podcasts during work and leisure time, atheism became a badge that I wore with pride instead of just kind of a convenient label. During this journey of learning many faith traditions and arguments for and against them, my own childhood faith remained relatively untouched. I regarded Mormonism as the same nonsense as any other religion, even though it was the religion that I happened to be raised in. Eventually, I stumbled on a few podcasts that talked about Mormon history, which piqued my interest more than other, similar deep dives into histories of other faiths. So I eventually looked for a podcast that was just Mormon history, straight, nothing but Mormon history, and there wasn't one. This was 2011, 2012. Podcasting was in an even more infantile state than it is in 2020 as I'm recording this revised pilot episode. No podcast contained the information I sought, so I went the old-fashioned way of reading books, something I never did for leisure my entire life prior to that point. But the more I read, the more I realized that Mormon history is wonderfully fascinating. And we don't have any documents about the foundations of Christianity, Buddhism, Islam, or basically any other religion rooted in ancient antiquity. But I was raised in a modern religion with extensive documents written by its founding members that we still have that are in private and public archives and libraries. Mormon history became a rabid fascination, and I continued my search for the perfect Mormon history podcast. It still didn't exist. By autumn of 2014, I decided to make the podcast I was looking for. My motivations at the time were complex, but also simplistic compared with what continues to drive me today. And that point brings us to what you can expect should you continue through the backlog, dear listener. When I started this podcast, I was in the process of learning about Mormon culture and history at an exponential pace while dealing with my own personal religious trauma. That fire raged in my heart. It kept me reading, writing, recording, and producing until late in the night while simultaneously driving a truck for a living. I did my best to kind of conceal my personal biases and motivations in the first few episodes, but the more that I learned, the more modern Mormon abuse came into focus, and I couldn't discuss the history without discussing the culture and its impact on myself and my loved ones. I began to see Mormons as victims of an abusive and religiously coercive system, from lowliest ward clerk to the highest echelons of the Quorum of Apostles. Eventually, I held absolutely nothing back. To hold back those thoughts and commentary on the culture of Mormonism would be leaving a part of me out of my work, my passion, my greatest creative endeavor. As I continued to learn more, I read more, I absorbed more, and eventually I attended Mormon history conferences like Sunstone, the John Whitmer Historical Association, the Mormon History Association. The more I met my academic heroes who write all of the books and articles that I voraciously consume. Simply put, I matured. The firebrand, the anger, the trauma, the wrongs by which I felt personally slighted eventually subsided and fell away. The fire that once propelled me through 16-hour workdays and microwave meals evolved into academic fascination. Eventually, I extended a plea to my listeners. I wanted them to hire me so my day job could become Mormon history instead of, staring at the inside of a truck windshield. And my listeners delivered. I'm so lucky to have the listeners that I do because I'm among the few people who gets to turn their passion into their occupation. And the episodes from that point forward reflect an evolution of my writing and presentation style from angry ex-Mormon to a history communicator with a massive body of academic literature from which to create the Serial Mormon History podcast. I also conducted lots of interviews. I met incredible people. I attended and presented at enlightening conferences across the nation. I was invited on dozens of podcasts to, do interviews and guest host. And then I eventually honed my skills of research and of writing. Now, I've thrown around the idea of wanting to record the early episodes again, to re-record those episodes. But if I did, it would sanitize the experience that I just described, removing what's made my journey through Mormon history what it is. The evolution from angry ex-Mormon to polished researcher and presenter would be lost, and that's a cost that I'm not willing to sacrifice. This podcast has been therapeutic to me, and my inbox tells me it has been therapeutic for many others, and I can't deprive us all of what that cathartic journey looks like. With that context in mind, here's a breakdown of the backlog. Joseph Smith's early life is covered in episodes 1 through 16. That's roughly 1805 to 1829. The Book of Mormon is published in the church founded with the New York era spanning episodes 17 to 24, which is the year of 1830. The most popular episode follows episode 24, which is a 7.5-hour treatment of the Book of Mormon. That's the longest episode by far, but most episodes vary from like 65 to 120 minutes. From there, the Kirtland era of the church spans episode 25 through 39, which comprises 1831 to 1837. The Missouri Mormon War of 1838 is covered through episodes 40 to 50. Episodes 51 to 214 cover the 5 years of Nauvoo history from 1839 to 1844, which really exemplifies how much more rigid and thorough my own research practices have become over the 6 years of this podcast, as well as the exponential complexity of Nauvoo history. Finally, episodes 215 to 224 are titled Road to Carthage, which, oddly enough, It's actually a great place to start listening to this podcast. Through that final 10-part Road to Carthage series of the podcast, I cover stories discussed throughout the entire 214 episodes leading to the death of Joseph Smith in Carthage jail, and I also cite the episode numbers in those episodes. Think of the Road to Carthage series as essentially like an index of the podcast, which may be more suitable to those of you who want a ton of Mormon history through, 20 hours of 10 episodes instead of 250 hours of 224 episodes. A brief side note, episode 223 is the Carthage gunfight itself. So if you want to Tarantino the podcast by starting with the end and then circling back to the start of it all, that's where you need to start episode 213. I also did a bit of advertising on the show at various points, but then I realized that my time is best devoted to patrons of the show at patreon.com/nakedmormonism. And there's a ton of extra content on that Patreon exclusive feed, and that allows me to be self-employed, and that in some ways, I believe allows me to retain my objectivity because I'm an atheist. I don't believe in any of these religions, and I'm not employed by any of these religions to study early Mormon history. On that Patreon exclusive feed, most episodes have, after episode 100, have a bunch of extra content at the end of each episode just for the patrons. And there's also Mormon audiobooks with commentary like Mormonism Unveiled, The History of the Saints, An Address to All Believers in Christ, Manuscript Story, Conneaut Creek, and, a few other early Mormon audiobooks. So if you want to help employ me and keep my objectivity in Mormon history communication, as well as find hours and hours of extra content, once again, patreon.com/nakedmormonism. I also encourage you to search for other podcasts where I've done collaborations, Scathing Atheist, Cognitive Dissonance, Latter-day Lesbian, Mormon Stories, From Priesthood to Pretty, Mormon Happy Hour, Wayward Willis, iFriends, The Thinking Atheist, and a litany of other podcasts. I owe a debt of gratitude to all of these wonderful podcast hosts for helping me on this journey. I also co-host Glassbox Podcast, doing deep dives on the Mormon angle of current events, and I was brought onto My Book of Mormon podcast to read through the Doctrine and Covenants, Mormon Scripture, to help provide historical content for each revelation. So if either of those topics interest you, I'd encourage you to check out all of those resources as well. Brief side note, if you would like to read along with the podcast, you can find all of the episodes on scripts.nakedmormonismpodcast.com, where all of the episode show notes are posted. You can read along with all of them. You can listen to the episodes there, and you can also add in comments and questions as well as corrections in the comments section below, as well as a search function on the website to allow you to search for any specific topics or events within the historical timeline and find on which episode those events were discussed. Huge thanks to Jeff Anderson, a listener of the show, who helped me put together all of the scripts, scripts.nakedmormonismpodcast.com. So a couple of final notes. The podcast contains nicknames for the most prominent characters of Mormon history. Yeah, nicknames. This is sure to be pretty divisive, but in my mind, it's a necessary storytelling mechanism. So if I asked you, what's the difference between William Phelps, William Law, and William Smith, could you answer that question with a few data points about why they're each important? But if you ask a fan of the show the difference between Double Dub Phelps, William Judas Law, and Crazy Willie, they'll instantly know that you're talking about Joseph Smith's personal scribe and ghostwriter, the guy who got Joseph Smith killed and published the novel Expositor, and the one who was his younger brother who tried to usurp Joseph's throne after his death. So having a nickname helps us construct a mental image of the person, and I'm excited for you, listener, to get acquainted with Not So Smarty Marty and Pistol Packin' Porter and Bloody Brigham Young and Professor Bill and Dibble Dabble, Piggy Bank Steve, Wreck-It Bennett, and so many other fascinating figures in Mormon history. Also in the early episodes, I swear a lot. It's a turnoff for a lot of people, and around episode 106, I eventually cut it out completely, so I hope that won't dissuade you from continuing to hit the next episode button. In many ways, the evolution of my language around that point is a microcosm of the evolution of my research and writing style. Final point, and then I'll let you go. As I'm recording this, I'm beginning a hiatus following the Road to Carthage series. That is to devote some time to fulfilling the promise that I made to my amazing supporters to put all of my research into a book and to get it published. It's my hope that by the time you've listened to the entire backlog, that book examining the influence of psychedelics in early Mormonism will be at some stage of completion. Maybe it'll even be on the shelves. We'll have to see. So stick around, and together we'll find out how my 7th year of rest resulted. So thank you so much for taking time to give this podcast a listen. I know that was kind of a lengthy introduction. You'll soon understand that my style is thoroughness with very little consideration as to how much time thoroughness requires. And that's my way of saying that I'm an insufferable windbag. You can contact me, Bryce Blankenagel, through email at nakedmormonism@gmail.com or on all of the social medias bearing Naked Mormonism. Hope to talk to you next time here on the Naked Mormonism Podcast. This podcast is produced with the help of Julie Briscoe as social media manager. Music is written and produced by Jason Camo of aloststateofmind.bandcamp.com and used with permission. Legal counsel is provided by Andrew Torres of the Law Offices of P. Andrew Torres and the Opening Arguments podcast. Naked Mormonism is a production of Ground Gnomes LLC. Copyright 2020. All rights reserved.